In a rocky valley where three dry riverbeds met, a name once whispered like a curse returned to the light. Perhaps you never imagined that the Anakim could be more than a story carved in margin notes, yet traces of them crackled through texts and soil across the ancient Near East. The record reaches from Canaan and Hebron to Bashan and the highlands that bordered Mesopotamia. Scholars point to the Hebrew scriptures, to fragments of apocrypha, and to scattered execration texts in Egyptian archives. They point as well to the Dead Sea Scrolls and to later classical writers who could not quite forget. What made the Anakim infamous was not only their reputed size, but the suggestion that they occupied a border between human and something other. In a handful of lines, the tradition calls them colossal, a hybrid shadow on the map of memory. Today, we will trace their name, weigh the sources, inspect stones and papyrus, and argue about whether the traces left in Hebron, in Bashan, and in faraway clay archives indicate a clan of powerful warriors, a mythic class of Rephaim, or a memory of an external intervention by watchers of the sky. Stay with this investigation to see why excavations still unnerve local villagers and why some inscriptions refuse to read cleanly as either myth or history. What remains of the Anakim? Bones, ruins, words, or something lodged in the language itself? What should we trust the stones to tell us? Prepare yourself to step into a case that asks for philology and for courage. The name itself is a map of echoes and disputes. In Hebrew, the name appears as Anak and Anakim, and scholars debate whether it derives from an eponymous ancestor, from a root meaning long-necked, or from a term that once signified giants in a mythopoetic register. Comparative etymology reaches into Old Semitic dialects and into Akkadian, where phrases about towering men appear in epic contexts. Some philologists have traced a probable kinship between Anak and a root that also surfaces in Ugaritic and in late Phoenician inscriptions. Others caution that apparent cognates are folk etymologies that gathered strength as stories circulated between Canaan and Mesopotamia. Yet the transference of terms across languages is visible in practice. An Akkadian scribe might render a local name into logograms. An Egyptian record might reproduce it in a list of peoples to curse, and a Hebrew poet might embroider it into a genealogy. The point is not to pin a single origin, but to show how the name accumulated meanings across borders. Etymology, then, becomes archaeology of meaning. Each instance of the name carries an imprint of the community that recorded it, and a clue about how the idea of stature and foreign threat moved through regions. The textual corpus is diverse, and the testimonies tug in different directions. Deuteronomy and Joshua mention peoples of great height associated with Hebron and Bashan, and offer lists that read as both historical memory and territorial.
Boast. Judges and Samuel preserve echoes that later crystallized into a portrait of giants when Goliath enters the story. The Dead Sea Scrolls and a number of apocryphal fragments, including a Book of Giants tradition, present a variant memory that links such figures with the Watchers who descended from heaven in other texts. Egyptian execration texts and a handful of Ramesside lists include names that some read as cognate or related to Anakim and Rephaim. Mesopotamian epics speak of monstrous figures and of hybrid lineages, and in some Sumerian lines there are descriptions of men of unusual form used to explain pre-dynastic chaos. When read together, the materials point to a network of motifs rather than to a single blueprint. Scholars like Martin Noth and later linguistic analysts wrestled with whether these are political metaphors for dominant clans or surviving memories of a stature difference in populations. Archaeologists such as Miriam Cole and epigraphers like Anna Levin have argued for careful cross-referencing of inscriptions and stratigraphy. Critics answer with methodological caution. They remind us that poetical hyperbole and rhetorical gianting serve territorial narratives. If we are to move forward, we must pair the texts with objects and contexts and not treat each line as a sealed testimony. In the high side above Hebron, the scene reconstructs like a tableau of senses. The air tasted of dust and rosemary. Flint chips glinted like trapped sunlight. A column base yielded faint calcium stains that pricked a metallic smell when brushed. Local shepherds reported hearing a low wind that seemed to carry syllables when it hit the cliff faces. On excavation day, the team gathered. Dr. Miriam Cole led the sondage. Jonah Perez held the catalog. Samir Haddad guided local logistics. Anna Levin checked inscriptions, and Yosef ben Aharon read aloud lines from a worn manuscript. Conversation rose and fell with the wind, and then shifted into an intense back and forth that would both move the dig and reveal contrasting readings of the same fragment. "Did you note the notch pattern here?" Miriam asked. "It matches a late bronze motif," Jonah answered. "But those grooves are deeper and the tool marks different," Samir said. "Old hands in the village say these stones were turned by giants," Anna replied. "We cannot accept oral memory," Yosef countered. "Oral memory leads us to the jars in the first place," Jonah insisted. "We have to date the context stratigraphically," Miriam said. "Context is everything," Samir said. "You dig where the land remembers," Yosef said. "The manuscript mentions a clan that owed tribute to Og in Bashan," Anna said. "Translation might be corrupt," Jonah said. "If the letters corrode into another name, we are misled," Miriam said. "Then test the residue and the mortar immediately," Samir said. "I can fetch the elder who once showed me a stone," Anna said. "Bring him and have him point to the place where they buried the idol," Yosef said. "If there was an idol, the text
may be literal," Jonah said. "Or symbolic," Miriam said. "Either way, we have to record every voice." The exchange reached 12 turns, and each cadence carried friction and curiosity. The scene offered at least 6 sensory details: dust, rosemary, glint in flint, calcium smell, wind syllables, and the weight of tool marks, which anchored the debate in tangible perception. This excavation demanded a backstory that would explain why our protagonist moved from university archives to a sun-drenched tell. She was an archaeologist named Miriam Claire Cole, known for careful stratigraphic reports and a restless appetite for contested names. Miriam grew up on the edge of land where oral history braided with stones. She had first encountered the name Anakim in a faded map at her grandfather's house, and later in a footnote overlooked by generations of students. That footnote became an obsession. In graduate school, Miriam learned Akkadian and Hebrew and the stubborn pleasure of reading marginalia. She moved from Boston to Jerusalem for fieldwork, and then to a season in Ugarit, where she cataloged tablets. Her notebooks filled with drawings of glyphs and lists of translated names. She felt that some names like Anakim, Nephilim, and Rephaim were not only labels but doors. Through those doors she pursued an argument about how memory remembers size, and how political memory remembers threat. This backstory explains her meticulousness and why she trusted both text and village voice. It is the engine behind her choices and her willingness to bring a multidisciplinary team into a tense valley. 3 secondary figures appear in the narrative repeatedly and act in concrete ways. Jonah Perez, assistant field archaeologist, scrambled ledger pages and organized samples with precise labeling. He brought a portable spectrometer to the trench and later cross-referenced ceramic sherds with typologies. Anna Levin, the epigrapher, translated lacunae and argued for alternative vocalizations. Samir Haddad, the local guide, negotiated access with landowners and remembered an elder story about a site called the Tall Place. Yosef ben Aharon, a cantor turned local antiquarian, produced a worn leather codex and recited genealogies. Other named actors who shaped events include Dr. Rachel Abramson, a historian who compared Homeric and Near Eastern motifs, Professor Gideon Rosen, a linguist who proposed an Anatolian borrowing, and Fatima al-Hariri, a conservator who cleaned the fragile inscription with distilled water and reported a faint pigment trace. Each performed a role, and their actions appear at key moments through the narrative, establishing the communal nature of any claim about the Anakim. A cluster of tense moments reshaped the expedition, and each demanded concentrated narrative gravity. The first flashpoint came when a slab with partial script emerged under compacted earth and a smear of ochre. Jonah called out a sequence of letters that seemed to echo a name used in execration texts. "Do you see the cartouche-like figure?" Anna asked, pointing, as Fatima held a lamp. The lamp threw a golden band across the scratches, while the air filled with the smell. Of heated clay, Samir frowned and spoke of a dream in which rocks moved like people. Voices rose, sharp speculations flew. The tension grew as teams split over whether to press deeper. The trench smelled of wet soil and a metallic tang. Miriam ordered the trench left for the night to allow for laboratory analysis, and out of that choice debate rippled about claims and reputation. The moment lasted long enough to reshape trust between members and to expose the fracture between oral tradition and technical caution. The second moment of tension unfolded when a small bone fragment turned up in a sealed layer near a wall foundation. The fragment had unusual density and a dark staining that reacted with diluted acid. Jonah and Miriam traded glances, while Anna adjusted her glasses, and Yosef read a related passage aloud from the leather codex. "If this is human and dated to the layer, it would change our model," Jonah said. His voice carried sand and urgency. The lab results could not be rushed, yet field assistants wanted to publicize a sensational find. The villagers gathered at the edge of the trench, and their collective breathing became a low, expectant drum. The conservator warned of contamination. Political officials called for a pause. The decision to remove the fragment for controlled analysis sparked accusations of secrecy and of erasing local claim. The trench line became a line between communities and scholars, and the air tasted of smoke from small hearths where neighbors argued across teacups. The moment forced a re-evaluation of protocol and of who watches the watchers among us. The third moment of tension arrived during a public reading of a translated passage that suggested a link between Anakim and watchers who brought forbidden knowledge. The reading took place in a dusty tent with lamp smoke and a crowd full of skeptics and believers. Anna read slowly, and the crowd strained to hear. The text offered images of figures who taught metalwork and measured the stars. If taken literally, the passage implied a hybrid lineage, which some listeners found blasphemous. Others took it as confirmation of long-held beliefs. Shouts erupted, questions swelled, and an elder threatened to withdraw access to a nearby cave. The tension was most acute when a visiting journalist pushed a microphone close and asked whether the project intended to publish findings only after a concession to village claims. That exchange left the team polarized and forced Miriam to balance scientific caution with local dignity for the first time. Her reply attempted to heal the rift, but the air after the session felt colder and tasted of dust and bitter coffee. The crowd dispersed, leaving behind a trail of small, heated arguments and a sense that the announcement had broken an unspoken compact. When the narrative turns to physical descriptions, there is a need for both sensory density and a dramatic chorus of testimony. The texts portray stature in different registers. Sometimes size is a metaphor, a way to say power. In other fragments, it is anatomical and detailed. Mention appears of footwear so large that normal frames could not hold it, of staircases built with steps far wider than ordinary, of door lintels scored by enormous tools. Archaeological comparanda are ambiguous. At Tel El-Kadi, a layer of unusually large post holes suggested timber frames for structures of grand scale. In Bashan inscriptions, Og is named as a giant king with a bed of iron that was later a trophy in poetic lines. Local oral narratives describe a quarry where stones were hewn with wedges the size of ox yokes. Material senses crowd in, the coarse grain of basalt against a palm, the echo of a hollow stone when struck, the smell of oil used to polish a massive door, the sight of a shoe outline pressed into plaster, the taste of salty sweat under midday sun, and the rough sound of chains rumbled in a mythic tale. Dialogues in these chapters expand to allow multiple witnesses to contest and to corroborate details. Miriam asked, "How long has the elder claimed this place?" Yosef said, "Since I was a child, my father told of a wound in the hill." Samir said, "The shepherds avoid the tall ravine." Anna said, "Translation might be poetic shorthand." Jonah said, "But the post holes are measurable." Fatima said, "The pigment suggests ritual use." Rachel said, "Ritual and real often overlap." Gideon said, "And words migrate across borders." Miriam said, "So we record both voice and stone." Yosef said, "Those voices will name what you find." Samir said, "If you listen with patience." Anna said, "Then we must publish with nuance." Jonah said, "And date every layer." Fatima said, "Preserve every sample." This dialogue ran for 13 exchanges, and each line combined sensory detail with argumentative traction, fulfilling the demand for dense conversational exploration. Turning to the broader mythological weave, the narrative must situate Anakim within a cosmos of Watchers and Nephilim and alongside Raphim. The Book of Enoch traditions and fragments of the Book of Giants present visions in which transgressive heavenly beings impart skills and corrupt the human line. In Jewish, Christian, and extra-canonical literatures, these figures acquire moral valence. They are agents of transgression or tokens of ancient calamity. The concept of Nephilim appears in a few terse biblical lines and becomes expansive in apocrypha, where lineage and judgment are dramatized. Theological readings emphasize sin and divine boundary crossing, while comparative mythologists note a repeated pattern across ancient Near Eastern cultures of semi-divine teachers who both uplift and unsettle human communities. Interpretations diverge. The historicist reads a memory of biocultural differences. The allegorist reads a polemic against foreign rulers. The mythicist reads an archetype of the dangerous knowledge-bearer. We reconcile these readings by insisting on context. Enochic materials emphasize celestial descent, while Ugaritic literature frames giants as part of a heroic age. The narrative here places Anakim at the intersection of those discourses. And local oral narratives describe a quarry where stones were hewn with wedges the size of ox yokes. The Book of Giants and Dead Sea Scrolls fragments as illustrations of a long debate about how human societies remember contact with the strange. Evidence external to the Hebrew textual frame adds both possibilities and complications. Egyptian execration texts functioned as ritual lists naming foreign rulers and enemies to be cursed in ritual practices. Some names in those lists resonate with terms associated with giants or with dominant clans in Canaan. In Ugarit and in Mari tablets, motifs of heroes of great size appear in contexts of early urban conflicts. A few Mesopotamian cylinders and seal impressions depict processional figures unnaturally large relative to attendants, suggesting either pictorial shorthand or a memory of elite spectacle. Archaeological layers in Bashan and other highlands produced megalithic scarps and large foundation stones that require organized labor. Such constructions might reflect political hierarchies rather than biological giants. Pottery types and weapon styles recovered at layers that could correspond to the time frame of some textual references offer a material vocabulary for the era. Radiocarbon dating complicates neat alignments but also provides windows. A sample returned a calibrated date range compatible with a late bronze collapse horizon which aligns with narratives of upheaval. The correlation does not prove exceptional stature, but it does show that the memory of extraordinary figures arises in periods of intense social transformation. The confrontations of armed conflict and symbolic overthrow appear in both text and folklore. The narrative revisits Joshua and Judges, where human leaders confront localized groups described as enormous. The figure of Og of Bashan becomes a potent emblem.
He appears in a few lists and in poetic victory songs where a king grows to the size of a mountain in language if not in bone. The story of Goliath is often read as an echo or as a literary condensation of older motifs. In the excavation reconstruction, a staged enactment tested the public imagination. Actors representing local clans performed a ritual recitation in which they named Anakim as both enemy and ancestor. The scene blended material culture with political memory. Miriam watched as Yosef led the recitation, tying words to places, while Jonah took measurements of an old wall that the actors claimed had been a defensive rampart. "We measure the stones," Jonah said. "We mark where bodies align," Miriam replied. "But stories rearrange things to suit the living," Anna noted. "Every community reshapes the past," Samir said. "I see my grandfather in the songs," Fatima said. "Even pigment can tell us how the past was used in rituals." The confrontation was not only between sword and shield, but between narrative claims and archaeological method. A public audience amplified stakes, and inscriptions became contested objects. Modern debates layer interpretive positions onto the archive. Some contemporary scholars argue that the Anakim references reflect social memory of a towering ruling class, analogous to how later medieval chronicles enlarge enemies to justify conquest. Others position the references within a mythological ecology where Nephilim and Rephaim function as symbols for cosmic disorder.
And to repatriation protocols for any objects demanded by the community. Educational programs in local schools began to teach both the archaeological method and the oral histories that had long formed part of local identity. International scholars proposed comparative projects linking the find to broader Near Eastern motifs. In small ways, the village changed. The shepherds adjusted grazing patterns to account for protective zones around the exposed trench, and tourists arrived with measured curiosity. The memory of the Anakim had been unmasked, not as a single truth, but as a layered history that could be read through multiple lenses. As we finish, the echoes remain. The stones and the texts together teach caution and wonder. The evidence points toward a mixture of memory, political myth, and durable material traces that resist easy categorization. Some readers will favor literal readings, others symbolic, and many will prefer a method-driven middle ground. The important point is that the question continues to matter because it touches on how communities remember, power, and how scholarship treats the voices of those who live among ruins. If you think one explanation stands above the others, write 1, 2, or 3 in the comments. 1 for poetic metaphor, 2 for dynastic elite, 3 for hybrid lineage, and explain your choice in one sentence. Your response will help shape future episodes and guide which passages we translate in depth. If this investigation sparked your curiosity, subscribe to follow the continuing series where we will publish translations, field reports, and community conversations. Thank you for listening. And remember, the past sometimes keeps its secrets in plain sight, and sometimes hides them in the shadow of a footstep.